Okay, so let's get started discussing this. Did each of you watch or listen to the podcast?
I did.
I read
I
the
listened and then I
transcript.
kind of skimmed it back to refresh. I skimmed back through the transcript.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
I skimmed the transcript. I wouldn't say I read it in full detail.
Yeah, and you've probably seen some of this before in various other places. It's, the transparency in learning and teaching approach is discussed a lot by many people. And I know we've discussed it on our podcast quite a bit. It did remind me that we should probably invite her, since we've mentioned her probably a couple dozen times, to actually have her on the podcast. So I did put a few slides together just to help structure things a little bit. Let me share my screen. And so I thought we'd start maybe with, why should we consider the TILT approach, the transparency in learning and teaching approach in classes?
Are you asking us?
I am asking you. This is
That
a
was not
discussion.
rhetorical.
This is a discussion. This is not a presentation.
Well, I think it probably was a good idea all the time, but especially now, again, students in and out, are they getting the direction that they need? What did I say in class? Did they pick it up? Did they listen? And, kind of even just looking at some of the handouts that kind of came with the podcast about the assignment, the templates, like looking through that, it's just like, if every student had that, regardless of kind of modality and stuff, they're kind of ready to start on the assignment. And then then looking at the template, it just kind of calls up how some of the best students grade-wise, the most successful students grade-wise, are partially successful because they get really good at figuring out what an instructor wants. Not just what is economics and how do I do economics, or how do I do calculus? What does this calculus instructor want?
Yeah.
And I've noticed that particularly with my son, who's done very well academically, my oldest one and stuff, he got very astute at figuring out exactly what they wanted. And there's clearly an equity issue of the social or cultural capital that made him do that. He wasn't born that way. He kind of developed that skill.
And should we have students focus on trying to figure out what's in our minds, or should we have focus perhaps on learning the concepts? And, and I know the same thing that, students, the first time going back a ways, when I'd give an assignment or a test, they'd often have no idea what to expect. And then they do a lot better the second time or the third time.
Right.
But this
approach, even before the pandemic, I got to taking, because I rewrite a lot of exams because I hand them back. So I got to taking old exams and saying, go somewhere in the library quietly, give yourself an hour and take this and see how you do. And if it's a disaster, that's not a big deal if it's a disaster on the third floor of the library there in that corner, right? Because then you can figure out what you've done. And I think some people took that advice for certain. I mean, I would say, when you say why tilt, I thought this whole podcasting, I guess I'd call it a stupiphany, because I'm like, oh, I should be doing that. And then I think I should have known that I should be doing that, right? I'm in my 26th year. So actually, you just discover something that I should really know better. So I felt a lot of that when I listened.
And that's how the podcast started, with Lily and Maeve talking about how this should have been obvious. It's just so clear when it's made explicit. And well, I put a few things together too. One is that a lot of the focus is on helping students understand what they know and how they learn, and also help us understand more how they learn. And if students better understand how they learn, they can learn more effectively, more efficiently. It makes the learning task more salient because you're explicitly providing a connection between what they're doing and what you want them to learn in the class, which they understand why they're asked to do certain things, why they might be asked to take certain tests over and over again, why you're using certain strategies in teaching. I know I've often mentioned in workshops and on some of our podcasts that, I do a lot of retrieval practice, and students often find that that's a lot of work and they don't quite understand it. But if you make it clear why you're using the strategies, it can help them understand that there's some learning benefits to it, which ties into both of those first couple of points. And one of the things that's discussed throughout this is a possibility of students having more of a say in how you structure the course. And that was discussed in the podcast, as well as lots of other work there. And if students feel they have more of a say in how they're being assessed and what they're doing, and you're listening to them, it gives them a little bit more of a sense of agency and more of a sense that they have some control over this, which again, makes them feel a bit more comfortable and puts them in an environment which is less threatening and makes it easier to learn. And it also, as you suggested, it forces us to think a little bit about what we're doing in our classes, that if we're going to make explicit why we're doing things in class, we have to have some good reasons for why we're doing things in class. And often when we start teaching, we just kind of do to students what was done to us because it's always been done that way. And this forces us to think about, well, is this really essential? Is this just something I'm doing because I think it's a really cool topic? Or is this really connected to what we want students to have to come out of this? And it also helps us to get more feedback on how they're learning and what's working and what's not working. Because a big component to this is giving students the opportunity to let us know how they're learning and what's working and how the approaches we're using are working. And, sometimes they may say, well, this isn't working for me. And we know that the evidence suggests that it's going to work, but we can at least say, well, I hear what you're saying, but here's why I still think this is useful. And here's the evidence from these studies of why it's useful. So the other thing, going back to the point Liz made too about equity, is that students who've been in a rigorous high school preparation or had really strong preparation for college have often learned how to develop those skills of how to read the instructor and how to know what to expect. Many of our students do not come into that. Many of our students come in from educational systems that are not as well developed, that do not prepare students as well for college. And this makes explicit, or this approach makes explicit what we want students to be doing. So, and the other is there's a tremendous amount of evidence from studies with now tens of thousands of students across many countries that the use of the TILT approach tends to reduce achievement gaps that are tied to income, that are tied to race, and to an even larger extent that are tied to first-gen status, which goes back to that issue of the hidden curriculum, that students in college prep programs tend to do pretty well because they've learned how to do these things. But that's a shrinking share of the students at our institution, particularly, and in higher ed in general. And that's a good thing, but we'd like those students to actually be able to not just go to college, but actually to be successful in college. And we aren't quite there yet. And this approach has been shown to significantly reduce some of those achievement gaps. Okay, I said I wasn't going to give much of a presentation, but sorry. What about at the start of the class? What are some ways we can build in this sort of transparency in learning and teaching into what we share with students at the start of the semester? Like in the syllabus, or if in our course shells and whatever learning management system we're using at the time.
Well, I think transparency can actually overlap with redundancy. So like in terms of due dates and things like that. But also I actually created, again, the big macro class that I'm doing, again, mostly motivated by the pandemic last spring. I basically said, these are all the little, small kind of low stakes assignments, and they're due week by week. So I went Tuesday to Tuesday. It's a Tuesday, Thursday class. But then I actually said, if you wait till Monday night, you're in for a rough time. And so I actually have, here's a suggested workflow. I would go through the study plan by this date, and I would do, so basically each week, I have like a module page document that says, this is my suggested workflow for. So in other words, some students, again, that successfully navigate college are already kind of portioning out or have the discipline to do their workflow or set up a time. And so being more transparent, I actually kind of did it for them. Said, here's a suggestion of these mini deadlines you should set for yourself so you can meet the overall deadline.
And even if you don't want to give them a schedule, you could give them the expected time it should take to complete this. Now, that's not going to apply for all students, but there are those those assignment calculators online. And using those could say, well, this is the amount of time we expect on average students might take with this. Your time may differ depending on your efficiency in reading and understanding or working through this, but this at least gives you a rough expectation of how long these things would work. I haven't done that. It's something I keep planning to do, but I've got to do it.
Yeah, I think so. But I would be worried about the challenge of students that work more slowly. We've also known that, like, if you gave 3 hours for a test, there are students that would take 3 hours, even though it's a 1 hour test, right?
Even if it's a 20-minute test.
Right. Give someone 20 multiple choice, and if you give someone 5 hours, they might sit there. So, that's, so I've always, I kind of read that sort of as an option, and like, I feel like that would open up a can of worms as well. Also, I think we as faculty don't have a good handle on student reading comprehension. So, our guidelines about what it takes to read, and then modality comes in. One thing I've discovered in the pandemic is, that 1 minute per question multiple choice guideline that you used to use in a classroom has no business being online, right? It almost
takes longer. Yeah.
Right. The screen reading comprehension to the screen, on a screen, so
distractions.
That's right. But I guess I think in general too, to set the expectations, you could say, well, this is a 3 hour course. So if you're spending another 6 hours a week outside of class doing it, that's okay.
I think that's the main reason for some time expectations, that students pretty much systematically underestimate the amount of time required. I've had students who said, I spent more time on this course than any other course. I've been spending 2 or 3 hours a week on this course outside of class. And, and for many students, that's the expectation they have. And it's one that had been borne out in high school and in some of their college classes. And, giving them at least an estimate of how much time they should consider spending, even just an aggregate thing, as you said, 2 hours of class for each hour of class time, is something that we all heard quite a bit when we were going to college. And we probably always didn't do that or ever do that, but at least reminding them that this is not something that should only take 10 or 15 minutes a day or a half an hour a week.
I feel like I'm doing many of these things, but they're not working. Like, I try to tell them, you may spend 6 hours a week and don't do it all the day before it's due, but we meet 3 times a week. That means spread that out into 3 sessions at least, if not smaller sessions every day. But this fall especially, I felt like nothing I said made any difference. So I don't know.
Right. Well, we're doing this. I also think, Zoe, are you teaching like mostly incoming freshmen?
Yes, incoming freshmen entirely this fall, or almost
and
entirely
so basically they just spent a year getting all kinds of leniency. So, in fact, they had high school teachers that said you need to do this, and then they ended up accepting it later, right? Or, this will go on your permanent record, and it doesn't. But, I do think the freshmen are particularly exacerbating or coming from a thing where they've been told you better do this, but then they've been kind of bailed out, right?
Yeah.
I wonder if you experienced some of your freshman students this semester, maybe you can, were they kind of shocked when you finally said, no, it's actually too late?
Yeah, and I really even didn't say it was too late. There were some who I would have offered incompletes if they would just respond to the email saying, can you tell me what's going on? But even that, I don't know. It was a rough fall.
It was a rough fall. And I saw that from, but you weren't alone. I think you've been on the chatter and the spaces where a lot of people teaching freshman courses, like, would they complete anything? Please complete this. Please turn it in. So many missing assignments. I taught upper level, so it wasn't quite the same experience, but I can tell they weren't where they should have been at this point.
I've never had as much of a problem with students completing work as this fall.
So I wonder how we can use this framework to even make it more transparent. Like, I've tried playing with the due dates and, should I have it due once a week, or should I break it into 3 deadlines, like throughout the week, and say, you need to do this tiny thing. And then they say, oh my gosh, it's so much work. None of my other classes have this much stuff due.
I got that a lot. Yeah. And I think some of it will be that they have been exposed to more than they expected this fall. And I think most students, the feedback is they knew they should be doing more, but they just weren't quite up to it, or they weren't quite ready for it. And we're not alone with that. That's something people everywhere reporting at every campus. But I'm hoping that students who came in expecting not to be required to do a lot or to learn a lot have at least somewhat adjusted their expectations for the spring. But it's going to be a challenge. And there wasn't as much learning occurring in high schools as anyone had hoped. And the evidence on that is really, really compelling. So maybe that will get better as more and more people are being forced back into classrooms this year. But
right, but I like, even now, you know, some of these school districts committed to in-person learning. Oneida is basically, the superintendent was saying the school board gave him carte blanche to hire basically any potentially functioning adult that can pass a background check.
Yeah.
to substitute teach. I'm like, oh yeah, there's gonna be so much learning in that school.
I've been seeing a lot of that in North Carolina, where pretty much you just need to have a college degree of anything. It doesn't matter what it is, and you can be a teacher while your teachers are out in the hospitals or wherever they happen to be.
Right. I mean, it'll be interesting what the state has to do, because I think, you know, we already saw this in the Oswego and Syracuse. They just had to close because they're like, I can't even go remote. I don't have enough people to offer a curriculum today. Right. So we're just, you know, and I think, yeah, I you know, I don't know how many missed days and how they're going to have to deal with that. Well, I guess we'll have to see. I mean, maybe maybe Omicron really kind of, we can see in South Africa and stuff, once everyone's been passing it around, it kind of plummets
peaked really quickly and then fell off just as quickly. That, you know, it was a 5 to 6 week spike. And I'm hoping that'll happen here, but the next 2 or 3 weeks at the start of our semester are going to be really, really challenging. So any other things on the start on setting the tone for the class in terms of creating that initial transparency?
I mean, I've really gotten about, you know, every in-class class or synchronous class, regardless of modality, starts off with saying, this is what's coming between now and next class, right? This is what we're going to be doing. This is what you have to be doing. So I'm trying to, again, it's a redundancy in communication, but also I think more transparency. If people were just following that and didn't even look at my written due dates, they should be able to follow along, right? So,
well, and you know, even ourselves, when we're told to do something once, we don't always quite pay attention to that. So students do need those reminders, just as we do, you know. Couple things I thought of, you know, is again, in your syllabus, there's always a list of learning objectives for the course, but you can also do that for individual portions of the course. And you can make explicit how what you're doing in terms of what you're asking students to do ties directly to what they need to learn. So making that explicit connection can help. Providing clear instructions. We always know what we want, and as we've talked about before, much of what students have to do is try to figure out what we expect of them. And it's a whole lot easier if we tell them exactly what we expect of them. And, you know, we could use rubrics, we could provide resources, we could provide guidance, and other things just to make clear exactly what we want. Another thing we could do in terms of the syllabus is we could give them a voice in it, that we could give them some options. In my spring upper level classes, you know, I don't really have a full syllabus until I meet with the class, where we talk about what they're going to be doing. I said, these are the things you have to come out of the class with. You have to be able to achieve these goals. You have to do some presentations. You have to, you have to be able to apply economic concepts to real world problems and so forth. It's a seminar course. And also in my econometrics class is a much more defined list of things they're going to do. But we talk about how the course is going to be structured, what the approach is going to be, and that can be adjusted a bit. You know, and you could create the syllabus and let them provide some feedback on that, or create a draft, or in some cases, you might actually shape the syllabus in your first class meeting or so. You know, that doesn't work in all classes. You know, when you have a really well-defined class, which very specific learning objectives, that may not work so well. But there's often some flexibility in terms of what types of assignments you're going to do, how frequent they're going to be, and what the weights of them are going to be, and so forth. And at least that can, again, give students a little bit more of a voice when feasible. In synchronous class sessions, well, here's one thing. You could provide a clear statement of learning objectives at the start of the class. You could put it up on the slide or whatever. But what else can we do in the class? Liz mentioned already, you can tell students what they need to do that week and so forth, or what they need to do before the next class to help frame it and to help them get prepared to know what's expected outside of class. But what else can we do in our classes to make learning a little more transparent?
Well, I'll actually give them a heads up when we're doing an example, say real versus nominal GDP, right? And calculating it. I'll say, this is, your problem set 2 that's due this coming Tuesday. There is a question just like, we're going to go over this question, then we practice it on iClicker. So I usually do one, then they do one. And I say, this is the skill you're going to need on the upcoming homework. And so it gives them a heads up that it's going to be important, and also gives them a reference point to go back if they're doing the homework. They can go back to the recording or whatever.
I know in my econometrics class, when there's things like that, those are the things that they go back in the videos to watch, because you can see in Panopto what areas are focused on, and it's those specific areas where they have to go back and use those specific skills. Anything else?
I'll also give them a checkpoint saying, we'll cover a topic, and I'll just say, and giving tests over a number of years, this is something that this is a trouble point for students. This is something they'll get wrong a lot. So, keep in mind that you might find this distinction challenging, but other students as a whole too, and this deserves your attention, or things like that. In the past too, when I've done clicker questions, I'll actually go back and I'll figure out from item analysis what questions were kind of most missed on prior tests that I've given years ago. And then that'll be our practice question. Like, here's a question from a midterm from 2017, and half the class struggled on this. So let's do this one together and see why.
Find those choke points in classes where students always struggle with, and focus more effort on it, and make it explicit that this is something that, that people always have trouble with in the first learning.
Right.
And sometimes I'll say, I remember when I first learned this was something that I made some mistakes on, just to make it seem a little more human there, that, they're not failing if they have trouble with this. It's something that we all have to struggle with when we first try to understand it. Any other? Well, one thing Liz mentioned is clicker questions, and doing something like that where you can assess, where students are getting some feedback on how well they understand things right away. That we get feedback from students on what they understand and what they don't, but so do the students themselves. They get to see, oh, I didn't get this quite as well as I thought I did. And then you could talk about, why there's these types of misunderstandings and misperceptions, and that there's a lot of benefits from making those mistakes in class where there's either little or no weight associated with making a mistake, so that students can focus their efforts on it before there are higher stakes assessments. Or problem sets, so doing problems in class individually or in small groups, or another way of doing the same sort of thing. Well, again, you could ask students to make connections between what they're doing and either the learning objective for that module or for the whole course. And then when you get to those points, you can use a just-in-time teaching approach to focus on the things that you observe that they're having problems with, and say, I see this is something that you guys are struggling with, as students always do. Let's go back and work through this in a bit more detail. So that they can see that you're helping them address those problems. And, and when they get a question wrong, it's a prime time to learn that material, because they recognize that they don't quite get it. And that's when they're most receptive to feedback and to learning from those mistakes. And there is some research that students remember things better if they get it wrong when they're asked a question than if they happen to get it right the first time they were asked, because then it no longer has that same relevance or salience as it does if they get it wrong and they want to understand why, so they don't make the same mistake later. And again, polls, exit tickets, and getting feedback from students on how they're doing, how they perceive the learning process going regularly is not a bad thing. With iClicker now, there's a built-in option to do an exit ticket at the end of every class if you choose to do so.
You know, when Lang came and talked to us a few years ago too, he adds now on problem sets and stuff, I always have one end question that says, you know, identify 3 key or 1, 2, you know, a takeaway from this week and, you know, related to how it's important to your life or society. That was his that was basically the wording. And I put something like that in a lot of my problem sets, kind of as the last question to hoe it out. So there's a bit of a delay. It's not sort of a real time, but there's that reflection component. And then hopefully it makes it more transparent. You know, the effort to complete that question is highly varied, right? So, you know, some people just pick, you know, just want to answer the question. They'll pick the first thing that comes to their mind. They clearly haven't thought about it. You know, others have. So that's.
In my online classes, one of the things I used to do was generally have students read something and then analyze it, or read 2 things and do a comparison. What I did this past semester, and I had been moving towards this a little bit before, is asking them to do exactly what you just described, asking them to take this and apply it to either something in their life or something they've seen in the news. And again, for that same reason, to make it salient, to make it relevant, so that they can see how this might be used beyond the course, just to give it that extra relevance to them. Any other suggestions for doing this in synchronous class sessions? One other thing Jim Lang mentioned with his reflection log at the time was he'd have students do a comparison between something they were learning now with something they had learned early in the class, to give it a little bit of space practice as well, and to help make those connections across different components of the course rather than just a block practice. So there's a little bit of interleaving going on there too. Okay, well, another thing is we pretty much have also been using the LMS more, no matter what modality we're teaching in. What can we do in the LMS perhaps to implement more of a TILT framework?
In some sense, I think it's easier to implement, but I wonder if the efficacy, because they're not as captive audience in reading through the things you create. But, you know, with modules, or go week by week, you can sort of reiterate the objectives for that week. You know, in Blackboard, I actually like the module page, right? Because that just shows up without even clicking on it. It's right there. And you can list, you know, for the week, you might have 3 to 5 bullets of things that they hope to get out of it. And what they should be doing, right? And this is what you have to complete by now, and what's due when. And so you sort of, again, reiterate deadlines and learning objectives and things like that. And then, as you mentioned, you know, for asynchronous discussion is another great way to try to apply, right? To make it stick. And so, you know, politically and economics, you're like, this is going on, you know, you can always find something going on right now that then relates to the topic you're covering that week. Right?
And somehow it always relates to the pandemic.
Right. Well, yeah, but like, you know, like inflation, yeah, you know, unemployment, labor force participant, you know, all of it. Yeah.
So we can use it to explicitly state goals, to provide resources to students. Okay.
Yeah, and I think the asynchronous format also, I mean, it rewards thinkers, right? People that need time to consider and response. There are always students that want to jump in and regular with a prompt, but that there are others that kind of need to think about it. And so at least that's, you know, my asynchronous discussions have never been my strong point in all my years of online learning, but at least there is that advantage that they sort of think about it. And,
they're much more equitable in that sense, because many students, particularly Asian students, but also first-gen students, are often less comfortable participating in discussions. So, because they want to reflect on what they say before they say it, and having that delete key while you're writing adds that. But that's another area where it takes a whole lot more work to participate in an online discussion than a face-to-face discussion, because a face-to-face discussion, there's often very little thought put into what people say in their discussion. But in an online class, people spend a lot of time formulating what they're going to say, some more than others, but it does provide that that comfort level of being able to polish something before you actually say it for many students. Okay, well, a few things I mentioned, you, as Liz said, explicitly state the learning objectives for the module. You can also give them with knowledge check activities, little short quizzes, mini quizzes, and other things, practice quizzes and supplemental resources, so that if they're not understanding things, you give them resources where they can go back and master the things that they're comfortable with. And, in a classroom, everyone's pretty much moving at the same pace. In an online class, some students will come in knowing some things pretty well and others not so well. Within your course module, you can let students focus their efforts on the things they don't know as well, if you're giving them feedback on what they understand and what they don't understand as well, and give them resources. One of the things I've done in pretty much all of my classes is I've added a lot of YouTube videos where I say, if you're having trouble with these concepts, go back and look at them, and I sort them by the specific learning objectives for that module. And that can be helpful if students use them. Often the students who use them the most are the students who are concerned that they might drop down to an A-, but at least they are there for, but that's not exclusively true. That some students who are struggling with specific concepts will go back and watch the videos. Often it will take other students saying, I found these videos really helpful. So if you can share that sort of feedback across students, that will often make it more comfortable for students to use resources as needed. And also, giving students feedback, mastery quizzing. I think we've all talked about these things in various other workshops and so forth, but letting them check what they know and giving them opportunities to make mistakes, learn from their mistakes, and be successful is really helpful before they get any moderate or high stakes assessments. Okay, what about assignments? We've often probably given students assignments and we've gotten back work which isn't quite what we expected or what we had hoped for. Sometimes it's much better, but that's by far the less common experience, I think. What can we do so that students will know more about what to expect going into writing a paper or completing some type of an assignment?
Well, I think the rubrics, and particularly the rubric in advance. Right. So students actually know exactly this is a 25-point assignment and these are where the points come from. Right. I think that's been big for me for any kind of writing assignment as well. And, again, it's a nice feature of Blackboard and to have the rubric right there. So when you grade in the rubric and then people can see where students can see where the problem areas are. But also, I guess, a sample, this is what an excellent paper would look like, and like the guidelines, very clear directions up front, right, as well. And for like a paper, like a project that's kind of culminating, really, I think you've got to budget some class time, maybe half a class for at least 30 minutes of class time where you're going through this, as well as having maybe printed guidelines.
And also talking about the purpose of the assignment, I think they broke it down and said, what skills will you learn that are useful for your daily life, and also what knowledge will you learn that's relevant for this discipline. And then just a really step-by-step process of what they need to do to complete it. They said, recommended sequencing. How do you go about turning this large project into a small, manageable thing?
Mm-hmm. And we can also build in some of that sequencing by having things due in stages and scaffolding it so that students don't get to the point where all of a sudden they have this 20-page paper to write by tomorrow morning, which was my common way of practicing when I was a college student. I was able to do this successfully, but most of our students tend not to. They seem to need sleep and so forth more than I did back then. But yeah, setting it up so that students do not put themselves in a position where all of a sudden they have a tremendous amount of work and they don't really know what they're doing. But if you scaffold it, where they give you something, you give them a small part of an assignment, you give them some feedback, and you can help guide them in the right direction so they don't suddenly get surprised that they did something that's entirely different than what you expected. or than what you valued or what you're going to grade them on. Rubrics, I think, pretty much hit on what we just talked about. Another thing, though, you could do is you could even have students help develop some of the rubrics. One thing that Ken Bain talked about when he was here way back was giving students some samples of writing assignments that are high quality, that he created, that were high quality, medium quality, and low quality, and send them into groups, read through those, and then evaluate them in terms of which were the high, medium, and low quality ones, and have them come up with a rubric determining why, what makes some work high quality and other work low quality. Again, it gives students a little bit more of a buy-in if they had some say in creating that. And it's easier for them to evaluate work and what constitutes good work when it's not their own, when they're looking at someone else's work. But once they define that, or even if you give them that rubric, it makes it a whole lot easier for them to recognize what they need to do, especially when they've talked it over with their peers. This is what high quality work consists of. And if they get agreement on that, you end up with a much better quality from the very beginning. In terms of providing samples of good work that works, one of the things I always used to be concerned with is whenever I did that, I would often give them one or two examples, and then everyone else would try to, in the next iteration, would try to emulate that with a very similar type of study or project. But what you can do, though, is provide examples of very different types of good work so that students can see that they have a lot of flexibility in what they do, and they don't need to just simply try to reproduce what someone had done really well in a previous semester. So providing good examples of acceptable or high quality work that are very different is a very good way of doing it. Now, you could create them yourself, or you could ask past students for permission to share some of their work as examples of that. And I've done both of those in some form or other. So any other thoughts about the podcast, about transparency in learning and teaching, or that podcast? And let me share the resources. This is just a series of links, some of which were actually in, let me put it in chat. Where's my chat? Come on. Oh, I got it buried on my other screen.
Finding the chat.
I've got that. I was teaching in person last semester. And, oh, okay. I know how to do this. There we go. I have given workshops on how to do that. There in the chat, there's a link to a Google Doc with a series of links, including a study that looked at the effectiveness of implementing a TILT framework, along with quite a few resources in the bibliography of that, if I remember correctly. Any other thoughts or reactions? Did either of you go to the Blackboard group to try that tool?
No, I did not.
Okay.
That was Perusall?
Perusall, yeah. Have either of you used Perusall?
I haven't, but I am signed up for the session. When is it? Later this week, next week? Because I do think it has some potential that Hypothesis doesn't have in terms of what books you can put in there and have students access by actually paying for them rather than trying to find PDFs of things that may or may not exist well in that format.
Yeah, each has some approaches. For text documents online, Hypothesis is superb. But Perusall offers options for textbooks because it is tied to publishers where students can buy them through the platform. But it also has some really good tools for audio and video, which are very similar to those available in things like VoiceThread or Flipgrid and so forth. Where basically, if you use a player in Perusall, you could pause at any point in the podcast and type some responses or provide some audio feedback to it or so forth. And then when people watch the timeline, they'll see that there's some feedback there that they could then respond to, either to you or to the original one. And it looks, I haven't tried it other than to set up that example and to set up the workshop, but it does offer some nice flexibility. Let me just stop the recording because this is getting a little bit off the topic, but I do want to mention a little bit more about that. Specifically,